All right, deep divers, ready to dive back into the wild frontier.
Always ready. It's a wild ride through history, that's for sure.
You know it. And this time we're going deep, like really deep. We're talking neoliberalism, covert ops, the whole 9 yards.
The 60s and 70s in Latin America. Talk
Yeah.
about a powder keg of intrigue.
Right. It's crazy how much was going on behind the scenes.
It really is. And what's fascinating is how the wild frontier connects the dots between U.S. foreign policy and this new ideology of neoliberalism that was taking root.
And how it all played out in Latin America. Not exactly a pretty picture.
No, not at all. We're talking about dictatorships, human rights abuses, covert operations. It's a lot to unpack.
Where do we even begin? I mean, we've got these big names like Milton Friedman, Friedrich Hayek. These guys were like rock stars in the world of economics.
Yeah, but their influence went way beyond just academic circles.
It's almost like they saw an opportunity in Latin America, a chance to put their theories into practice on a grand scale.
And that they did. But here's the thing. Their brand of economics, this neoliberalism, it came with some pretty controversial baggage.
Controversial is putting it mildly. I mean, these guys practically advocated for putting freedom of capital above all else, even democracy itself.
There's that one Hayek quote, it's chilling. He said, "I prefer a liberal dictator to democratic government lacking liberalism."
Wow. Yeah, that pretty much sums up their stance, doesn't it?
It really does. And it's scary to think that these were the minds shaping U.S. foreign policy at the time.
Because it wasn't just talk, was it? This ideology had real-world consequences, especially in Latin America.
Exactly. It laid the groundwork for things like Operation Condor. Have you heard of that?
Oh yeah, wasn't that like a secret alliance of right-wing dictatorships in South America?
Essentially, imagine a coordinated campaign of political repression, state-sponsored terrorism, all designed to eliminate any perceived threats to their power.
And the U.S. was involved in this.
Deeply involved. We're talking training military leaders at the School of the Americas, providing financial aid and weapons to these regimes.
But turning a blind eye to the human rights abuses happening right under their noses. It's a dark chapter in U.S. history, that's for sure.
It is. And the Wild Frontier really digs into some specific cases that highlight just how deep U.S. involvement went. Chile in 1973, for instance.
Yes, the overthrow of Allende.
Right. Allende, a democratically elected socialist, seen as a threat to U.S. interests in the region.
And the U.S. just couldn't have that, could they? So they backed a coup.
Well, Majfud presents a very strong case that the U.S. was actively working to destabilize Allende's government, even potentially orchestrating the coup itself. It's a pretty damning indictment.
It really is. It's one thing to read about this in a history book, but Majfud lays it all out there, connecting the dots between ideology, foreign policy, and the very real human cost of these interventions.
And it wasn't just Chile. Uruguay in 1973, Bolivia in 1971. These were not isolated incidents. There was a pattern here, a playbook, that the U.S. seemed to follow time and again.
Destabilize a democratically elected government, often through economic warfare or covert operations.
Then, when the situation is ripe, back a coup and install a right-wing dictator who's more sympathetic to U.S. interests.
It's a pretty chilling formula when you think about it. And sadly, it worked again and again. So we've got these dictators, some of them propped up by the U.S. Now what? Did they just get a free pass to do whatever they wanted?
Well, not exactly. Remember those neoliberal economists we were talking about? They weren't just armchair academics.
Right, the Chicago boys in Chile. They actually got to put their theories into practice.
Exactly. And they went all in, full throttle with their free market experiment, privatization, deregulation, slashing social programs. It was a radical makeover of the Chilean economy.
And how did that go for the average Chilean?
Not so well, to put it mildly. Unemployment skyrocketed. Social inequality exploded. People who were already struggling were hit the hardest.
That's awful. It's like they forgot about the human cost of these economic policies.
It's a classic case of ideology trumping compassion. And here's the thing. It wasn't just Chile. This model, this blueprint for imposing neoliberalism, was exported with U.S. support to other parts of Latin America.
So it was like a one-size-fits-all approach to economics.
Pretty much. And the results were often just as disastrous. But remember, this was also the height of the Cold War.
Right. Fighting communism at all costs.
Exactly. And that meant controlling the narrative, shaping public opinion.
Here comes the propaganda machine.
You know it.
Yeah.
And the CIA was at the forefront of this. They poured millions of dollars into propaganda efforts in Latin America.
Really? Like what kind of stuff were they doing?
Everything from secretly funding newspapers and radio stations to planting stories, influencing editorial decisions. They even had journalists on their payroll.
Wow. It's like something out of a spy movie.
It really is. And it's a reminder that we can't always believe what we read or hear. We have to be critical thinkers, question the source, look for multiple perspectives.
Easier said than done, right?
Yeah.
Especially when you're being bombarded with propaganda from all sides.
Absolutely. But it's more important now than ever. We're seeing a resurgence of disinformation and propaganda just like in the Cold War era.
It's like history repeating itself, but with a digital twist.
Exactly. But it's not just about the big picture, the geopolitical games. The Wild Frontier also tells the stories of the people caught in the crosshairs of these events.
The victims of these dictatorships, the families torn apart, the activists silenced.
Right. People like Charles Horman, the American journalist killed by Pinochet's regime, his story is just one of many.
It's a reminder that behind the headlines, behind the political maneuvering, there are real people whose lives are forever changed by these events.
Exactly. And we can't forget that. It's their stories that remind us why it's so important to keep fighting for truth, for justice, for a better world.
It's heavy stuff, you know. Makes you think about the world a little differently.
It really does. And that's the power of a book like The Wild Frontier. It challenges us to confront these uncomfortable truths about U.S. foreign policy.
And to see the human cost of these interventions, not just as statistics or headlines, but as real people whose lives were forever changed.
Exactly. And those ripples, those echoes of the past, they're still felt today, not just in Latin America, but around the world.
So where do we go from here? I mean, it can feel overwhelming, right? Like, how do we even begin to grapple with all of this?
Well, I think the first step is simply acknowledging that it happened, recognizing that these events weren't just isolated incidents, but part of a larger pattern.
A pattern of intervention, of using economic and military might to shape the world in a certain image.
And that's why it's so crucial to be aware of history, to learn from the mistakes of the past so we don't repeat them.
Because those in power, they're still playing the same game, aren't they? Just with a new set of players and a slightly updated playbook.
Sadly, yes. Which is why it's more important now than ever to be critical thinkers, to question the narratives we're being sold.
To be our own BS detectors.
Yeah.
To seek out multiple perspectives, to do our own research. It's a lot of work, but
it's essential if we want to create a more just and equitable world.
Well said. And on that note, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive for today.
Until next time.
Keep those minds curious, deep divers, and we'll see you on the next one.